original photographs that were pasted into the book. And each of the copies of the book that I had a full set of those photographs that were pasted into it. And I can find it quickly. The graphs were produced with something called letraset. Now, I'm not sure if all of you are old enough to remember letraset, but it was sort of like a stencil. You had a sheet of dots and triangles and things, and you sort of stenciled them onto the page, and then I had a rubber flexible ruler thing that I used to draw the lines with. So back in 1978, it was all very, very basic. And yet just 6 years later, when I was still a student, a bit of a perpetual student, me, I was doing a diploma in management studies, and even in 6 years, things had changed in that we'd gone from typing to word processing. It was still fairly basic. It wasn't anything like the word processing packages that we have these days. But if you look at 2 pages side by side, you can see a difference between a typewritten and a word processed sheet. Jump forward 20 years to the management reports, and by that time we were using computers. All the charts and diagrams were produced with the word processing packages rather than having to be drawn by hand and things like that. So in 20 years there was quite a big jump in terms of how it became easier to actually produce the words. And there were also a lot of changes going on around the same time in terms of the actual production of the books. So for traditional books, of course, they were always done with typesetting. So it was all, you know, you see the letters all put out, and it was all very manual. For an Indy, it would tend to be typed, as I've shown you before. But from the 1990s onwards, we started having desktop publishing packages, and it became easier to lay out books and prepare them for publishing. We also had changes in terms of the technology for producing the books. I'm going to talk about paperbacks, but obviously hardbacks are there as an option as well. But the traditional way of producing a run of paperbacks, of course, was to get them produced from the printers. That's still the standard way that most books are produced, is by physical print. You know, a lot of us still use that as one of the options. But also, we then had a move towards print on demand as an option, and when books started to be being produced from PDF files as opposed to having to be laid out and typeset, then print on demand became an option, and again it became a lot easier. And of course then we had the huge jump from physical books to ebooks. Amazon actually brought their first ebooks out in around 2000, but they tend to be they weren't particularly successful. And I think it was about the 4th generation of ebooks that came out in 2007 in conjunction with the Kindle. And of course that was when there was a massive change in terms of production of books. And a lot of people, when they talk about indie publishing, they tend to think of indie publishing and ebooks as being synonymous. And to a certain extent they are. In fact, there are some indie publishers who only produce ebooks, but it's not necessarily the case. But as I say, from 2007 onwards, it became a lot easier to produce them ourselves. And then the other change, which I'm not really going to touch on, Mark knows this a lot better than me, is the whole area of ebooks, which I've not really gone into yet. But audiobooks had been around since the sort of 1930s, but it was from 2011 that you started getting the software that made it possible for indie authors to either do the full production themselves, or at least do a lot of it with contracted out, but do a lot of it. So again, we've got to the stage where it was a lot easier to produce books than it used to be. And another thing that's changed, that seems to actually go up and down, is batch size. If you think back to medieval times, when the monks were illustrating the manuscripts, the batch size was 1, because they only ever worked on 1 at a time, and it took them a long time to produce it. I think it's probably fair to say that batch size is always cost related, and decisions that are taken on what size of batch you produce very often are based on cost. When I produced the doctorate, I think, I have to say it's a long time ago and I don't have any of the paperwork for it, I think we produced something like 6 copies. And they were relatively expensive because they had to be, you know, individually prepared, and all the photographs and everything. When we got to the management reports, I said that one was selling at 595. The batch run that they produced then was 200. So the worldwide sales they expected of that book was 200. We actually sold something like 196, so I was quite pleased with that. That wasn't a bad one. That report was issued in 2nd edition 5 years later, and in a 3rd and final edition another 5 years later. And in the 10 years from the 1st edition to the 3rd edition, we went from a batch size of 200 to a batch size of 1, because by 2008, when the final edition came out, we got print on demand in place. So it made the options for the publishers much more flexible, and they never did a print run. I think the second one they did a short print run, but the third one was never anything other than print on demand. With my own books, that first one back in 2011, this will sound so familiar to a lot of you. We made the rookie error. We published 1,000 copies of that book, and I have to say it was all my fault. Sharon said it was too many. My husband said it was too many. I can remember banging my fist on the table and saying, if we can't sell 1,000 copies of this book, we shouldn't be publishing it. Of course, that was complete and utter rubbish, and I still have a few left in the office to show that I was wrong. But one of the reasons we had 1,000 done was because whether you print 100 or 1,000, the setup costs were the same. So if you have 100 printed, then the setup costs were divided across 100 copies. If you've got 1,000 copies, then the costs are divided over far more, so the unit cost comes down. And we were trying to keep the unit cost relatively low. Now, 9 or 10 years later, I've got to the stage where for this novel, for example, I only had a batch run of 100. Most of my physical sales now are print on demand. I do a batch run because I always have a launch party here in Chudley with lots of fizz and cake and music and stuff like that, and it's quite nice to have enough copies to sell. But as I say, I'm down now to 100 copies, and for this one, The Business of Writing, my batch size is 1. I only ever have those done as print on demand because the market is different. The number of people who are going to, I don't have a launch party for a book like this. It's a book for writers, not for general readers, and therefore the market's different, and I treat it differently. So say my batch size is now 1. And just a couple of things to finish with. One of them is who does what. we go back to my doctoral thesis, I actually learnt to type in the year before I finished the doctorate. But in the event, I knew I was never going to be, at the time, I wasn't going to be a good enough typist to get that finished. And my mother, who was a secretary, did it for me. But and then when I did the second one, when I did the diploma in management, it shows in the acknowledgements, the ladies of the word processing department at Wellcome, which is where I was working, did it for me. And a lot of things was a skill had rather than something that everybody did. Whereas these days, you know, some of us tend to do it like that, some of us do it like that, but most of us do our own typing most of the time. Publishing was something which was done by specialists. Now it's something with the technology, with the software that's there, we can all have a go at it. And the printing is still done by other people, but we have much more control over it than we used to. And then the last change, really, the last big change I've seen over the time is the market and how you can get at it. I mean, when I did my thesis, I actually gave those copies away because nobody was going to buy them. And I wasn't going to try and sell them. But if by any chance I was going to, but as an indie, all I could really do would be reach local people. And for a long time, all you could do is reach local people. To a certain extent, if you had the contacts in bookshops, you could reach maybe nationally. But again, that's quite difficult to do. Now, with ebooks, with print on demand, with ebooks, the world is there and the market is much bigger, the market is international, and we can all access that market, whether we're independent, whether we're traditionally published or whatever. And that's a very quick canter through the changes in the technology over the 40 years.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is indeed a very quick canter over that time period, isn't it? But I think you summarised it beautifully. If anyone has got any questions they would like to ask Elizabeth, do please, or somebody just did. I was just going to say, do please pop them in the group chat and I will take them to you. So Diane has asked, can you comment on covers and differences?
You mean from a technical point of view? Actually, can I go back to gallery and then I can see everyone?
Yeah, Diane, if you could clarify, are you thinking about the technical side of producing covers or the look of covers over that period? I'll come back to that one in a second when Diane has...
yeah, sorry.
Oh, you're there. There you go. Perfect.
It was more, I suppose, in terms of input on your own cover if you're self-publishing, as opposed to more expert advice if you're going through a traditional publisher, or indeed the requirements of the market if you are publishing on a different type of book. I mean, like a business book as opposed to a fiction book. I just wondered if you had any general comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I haven't said, but I will say now, is that there should be no difference in look between an independently published book and a traditionally published book. And the cover is one of the things that gives it away very, very quickly. I have no artistic bones in my body at all, and I use the wonderful Bernie Stevens to produce my covers. But as the contract manager, if you like, as the project manager, I have control over I tell her the sort of things I want and what sort of concepts I want. She puts proposals up, and then we go on it. We decide on it together. But I'm happy to use her advice because she's the one that has more experience in it. I'm not sure that everyone will agree with me on that, but I actually believe that it's less of an issue with non-fiction than fiction. I think with fiction, there's a lot more if you pick a book up because the cover tells you what it is. You know, hopefully that says thriller rather than romance. Somebody who's buying The Business of Writing Independent Publishing is going to be buying it because they know the book is there and because they're interested in the topic, rather than because they like the cover. Having said that, so what I tend to do is I use templates. So this was a Canva template, and I've used the same template for each of the series, and I've just changed the color each time. So I've used, if you like, by using a template, I've used a professional design, but I've sort of made the final decisions. That's the question.
Lovely,
Yeah,
thank you, Elizabeth. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing? What was it I wanted to ask? Yes, is there any difference, do you think, with covers of ebooks? Are they still as significant, even though you don't see the cover and it's the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, they're even more critical, because what people tend to see is a thumbnail. So they need to be fairly simple. If they're too busy, they're not, you know, people don't pick up on them so easily. So yeah, I think they're important. Certainly the front cover is, obviously you don't need to worry about the back, but then you don't have the blurb on the back, but you have it in the in Amazon or wherever you're selling the book.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got about 8.5 minutes left. Questions from 3 more people, so we'll try and squat all of those into that time if we can. So the lovely Helen from this morning's crime panel has asked a 2-part question here. She's read your Suzanne Jones series about Big Pharma on Kindle Unlimited. What made you decide to put the series on Kindle Unlimited? Because that means that your ebooks have to be exclusive to Amazon. And then secondly, she also wants to know how much of it's based on reality, because it's all rather dark.
Okay. Kindle exclusivity versus wide, it's the big question, is it? That, and I have to say, I tend to change my mind. I did believe that wide was the right way to go for a while, and I've spent the last 2 or 3 years with them all wide, but because of everything else I'm doing and because of my priorities, I don't do enough marketing on all the other platforms to justify it. So I decided to bring them back into Kindle, because then you've got Kindle Unlimited, you've got an alternative source of income by doing it that way. So at the moment, it's all in KU. Whether I will push it out to wide again at some point, I don't know, but I keep wearing it. And how much is true? There are elements of truth. In Counterfeit, the conversation with the Minister of Health, where he says, I can't afford to worry about quality, I've got to get enough drugs in the country. I had that conversation with a Minister of Health in one of the Southern African countries. And the whole major crime in corruption is a real crime that happened in this country back in the 1980s. And what I did was I shifted it halfway across the world and 20 or 30 years forward in time, so I could sort of disguise it a bit. But there's little bits, but the major stories are fiction.
Excellent. Thanks for that one, Helen. Sheila has asked, since the batch size became 1, did that, or to what extent did that affect your thinking about remaining an indie author?
Yeah. The batch size has had no effect at all on my thoughts about being an indie. I do think every so often, every time I write a new book, I think, should I go down the traditional route? Should I have should I go that way, because that would give me more time for writing rather than marketing? The whole thing about control, about controlling the time, controlling the money, controlling the covers. I think I'm probably going to stay in indie, because I've said for the last few years, I'm too old to work for anybody else. And Sheila, you know me well enough to know that if I want to have an afternoon off and go and sit in the sunshine, I will do. And if I'm working to somebody else's deadline, I can't necessarily do that.
Excellent, lovely. Thank you very much. There's one more question. I was trying to save it till last because Debbie had to pop out of the room by the looks of it, and she's not there, but she can always watch it back later on, or somebody can tell her. So Debbie asked, how do you write your books now? Do you type? Do you write by hand? Do you use voice recognition or dictation?
I do everything. I type everything. The only time I write by hand is when I am, if I'm away, if I'm on holiday. And actually, at the moment, I'm writing my lockdown diary by hand. I sit in the sunshine and write that by hand. But all my books, I prepare. I do them on Scrivener, and then I put them at some point from Scrivener into Word and work on them like that. I've not explored voice recognition. I'm not sure that I could work with that, because I think I have too many ums and ahs and thought pauses and things. So I'm not sure, but I'd be interested. Actually, I'll grab hold of Debbie afterwards and find out whether she uses it and whether she finds it useful.
It's interesting, isn't it, how different people work in different ways. I remember I had a conversation with Michael Jex, quite prolific crime writer, for those that don't know. And he said he swore by this gadget, which I cannot remember the name of now, but essentially you type into it, and then when you get home, you plug it into your computer and upload what you've typed. So when you can go out, you can type into it, but you cannot delete or go back or change anything. You can just type stream of consciousness and then upload it to your computer. You can obviously edit it later on then after that. But he found that actually he works really well just writing without being able to delete or make corrections or whatever. Personally, I couldn't do that, but it worked really well for him. I don't know whether anybody else felt that they could do that.
Oh, I can do it. I have no problem at all with writing screeds and pages of complete garbage, and I'm quite happy to keep doing that. And then I very rarely actually go back and look at any of it until I'm at the editing stage, and then I'm sometimes quite surprised at what complete garbage I've written. But at least you can edit garbage. You can't. You can't edit a blank page. Mark Dawson uses voice recognition, and he reckons that's pushed his productivity way up.
I suppose it depends on what you're writing as well. I mean, I'm a non-fiction author, and it's much harder to write non-fiction without being able to make changes as you go along, because you're constantly trying to tweak things. So it wouldn't really work for that. And it's interesting you mentioned Scrivener as well, because I know some people swear by Scrivener and some people absolutely hate it. But a lot of people seem to find it very beneficial. I think that covers all of the questions that are in there, and there's only 2 minutes left, so I shall just wrap up by saying, if you want to find out more about Elizabeth's writing and her work, the link to her website is there at the top of the group chat. Similarly, the link to the Libraries Unlimited website, if you do wish to make a donation, is also in there as well. There are 2 sessions remaining now today at the Literary Festival. The next one is at 5:30, which is Liz Shakespeare discussing her book Postman Poet about Edward Capon from Bideford, and her historical research into writing that book, which I know will be fascinating. And then at 7 o'clock, Tracy Norman is talking about her research into one of the very obscure and unusual allegations of witchcraft which took place around Crediton in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the implications for that. That was a case that was heard at the court in Crediton and is very, very unusual. If you wish to sign up for either of those and you haven't, please just email the library and let us know, and we will send you out the meeting details for those. In the meantime, with a minute left to go in this session, please show your appreciation to Elizabeth for her talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. And a closing comment from Susan in the chat, who says she remembers Letraset only too well. I'm sure many do. Lovely, thank you all for your time. I hope you found that enjoyable. I'll see some of you later on in another session, but otherwise enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.